Hey, everyone who's joining us. We just finished a great talk with Aaron J. Kernis, and I'm really excited that you can all join in. Um, when I was putting together this afternoon, I thought it would be really interesting to have Aaron and Joshua on the same afternoon. They've worked really closely together. Aaron wrote a concerto that Joshua did a beautiful recording of. And I actually was first introduced to Joshua through Aaron, and we were talking about guest artists and who's great and who I should be inviting to be a part of the festival. And without a doubt, Aaron said Joshua was number one, and I totally agree. Also, I think it fits in well with what we've been talking about today. If you were joining us earlier, we have an ongoing series of financial workshops for artists. And the topic of today's discussion was portfolio careers. And this sort of dovetails nicely in a way with what Joshua is all about. Um, Not so much a portfolio, but a cornucopia. He's one of the most creative people that I know. He's a cellist, he's a composer, and he's a curator, he's a thinker, he's a communicator, and I think really represents kind of the best of what an artist can be today. He's not hemmed in by categories. He's really interested in thinking broadly, not just through music, but kind of culturally too. So I'm really, really thrilled to have Joshua here today, and so glad that you could all join us. And I want to introduce him and have you all welcome him. Joshua, it's great to have you.
Hi, Peter. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It is such an interesting year. I know that's a loaded statement. Seems like every day has something new to reveal, and some of it is new. But a lot of what I want to talk about today in terms of artistic process and career revolves around things that I think about a lot in a bigger context as well of life. It's just, what's underneath everything? What's really driving it? How does everything fit together? How do we connect a 30,000-foot view with the mundane everyday details? What's in between there? How does that all fit? Um, I would love, as I go along, I'm going to ask you some questions. And so if you have a keyboard and can type in the chat, I've got the chat over there. So it'll help me get a sense of some things and sort of guide my presentation. And of course, we'll do question and answer as well. But to start, before I say anything else, I would love if you are able to, if you can type your instrument and whether or not you are also a composer or improvise, and where you are tuning in from. So those three things: your instrument, um, whether or not you're a composer, improviser, and where you're tuning in from. And I'll go ahead and get started. So Peter, that was a really wonderful introduction. Thank you. Aaron has been a part of my family for a long time. He's my original New York family, and we've worked together quite a bit. The concerto that he wrote for me is a wonderful example. And by the way, I see the comments coming in. Thank you for that. Um, it's a real privilege to be able to work with such thoughtful, engaged artists, and in our industry to really have friendships that cross those lines of, what in other places might just be colleagues. So it really is like a big family. Peter mentioned some of the things that I do, but I actually just wanted to start out, give a sense of some of the words that I associate with. I'm going to give you my story, or a version of my story today, some context before we get into the questions, and we'll talk about some things along the way. But some of the words that I identify with: obviously cellist, composer, improviser, curator, and then it gets bigger into musician, artist, entrepreneur, maybe, activist, perhaps, and human. So how do all of those fit together? I mean, this is, again, I think a lot of what I want to talk about today is how does everything fit together? And description of this talk, I put in some questions, and we can return to these later, but I want to just put those out there. How do I find my voice in music? How can I get comfortable with the constant artistic evolution of process? And by that, I don't just mean evolving as an artist. I mean rediscovering what the process is like and changing even the process of evolution, discovering new layers beneath what is actually on top, beneath the surface. How do I make this journey into a career? Are they the same? Are they separate? What should I put my energy into? How do I make that choice when there are so many options? And maybe most importantly, how can I make sure that all of this serves others? So those questions sort of as a backdrop, let me know if it gets a little loud. I've got a friend's 3-year-old. I'm staying with a friend right now, and there's a 3-year-old running around in the house, and I think she'll leave us alone for the most part, but let me know if she gets a little too loud. So how can I serve others through all of this? These questions are in the background, so sort of think about those. I'm going to give you my story, and we'll sort of use that as the context, and maybe I'll be able to answer some questions, and we'll be able to talk about some things I want to hear from you as well. So I am from Oklahoma. It's not the first place people usually think about when they think about classical musicians. My family is musical. My parents are both church musicians who had also studied some classical music. There was violin. My dad played the cello for a little while, and they started me at the age of 3 because they thought it would be a great way to get a college scholarship, which is true. It's much easier than getting a sports scholarship. If you can play an instrument, you can play in the school orchestra for a decent college and have it paid for. I was pretty much the only musician, or the only person really serious about being a musician that I knew when I was growing up. I took it seriously from the start. I loved it when I was 3, and by the time I was 6, that was all I wanted to do. I knew that I wanted my career to be that. Of course, growing up in Oklahoma without the infrastructure of New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago, I did not really know what that would look like. And so I took my cues from the musicians that I admired, like Yo-Yo Ma and the Beatles, and had some sort of amalgamation of those as my dream. You know, I'd be like popping around like they were and doing all of that. My parents were very encouraging and put me in every situation that they could where I was playing music. They did not really want me to pursue it as a career, but they thought it was a great artistic endeavor. And again, that education. The thing that happened, and this is where it starts to relate later to some of the questions that I began to ask myself later on, because I was the only cellist really that I knew and the only serious musician, especially at that young age, I was constantly making music with people who were not classical. I learned to improvise around the age of 9 or 10, because there wasn't really chamber music for me. So I just played with people. And my dad put me up in the church band and said, play along. And I didn't have music. And so he said, just make noise. And if it sounds bad, play a different note. So I had very practical experience and lessons in rock and roll and bluegrass, in contemporary Christian music of the 90s, in all sorts of things. I was just the cellist with everybody else who was making music. And it was just as likely that I would be making music with my friends Nathan and Tyler on djembe and guitar as anything else. I also started learning jazz bass. It was a misunderstanding about whether or not I played bass, and someone ended up giving me a bass, and so I joined a jazz band. I picked up the guitar and played in bands. I played electric bass. I learned how to sing, not well, but well enough to lead worship at the church. It was just a very active and varied musical life that also was really engaged with people in a more, I don't know, the words that people use now escape me, but I was in the community. I wasn't in concert halls. I was never in official recitals. We put one on at the church once or twice, but that was the church people that came. It was just after church. People went and ate lunch and came back. So my initial experiences and my vision for what I would be as a musician was that a musician in the community. I didn't know that there was a classical music community that I could be a part of. I didn't know that people just did classical music. I kind of assumed that if you played music, you played all the music you liked. And you would be like Yo-Yo Ma combined with the Beatles. That was it. So it was very interesting to me when I started going to music festivals and then I went to conservatory, that I was having this experience where all of a sudden I was with people who really knew the cello, who really knew the music that I was practicing for my lessons, didn't know necessarily all that other stuff, but I really got to dive in deep. And for a while, that was very valuable, especially in conservatory, I think, to just spend time working on geeking out about form, about theory, about technique on the cello, about expression. How far can I take Shostakovich? How much can I learn about Beethoven, about that very specific sort of vetted tradition? But that was something that didn't last. It wasn't super satisfying for me for very long, and I did start doing things outside of that. I would do random collaborations with some of the art students. I ended up doing this theater production at this place called Dobama Theater in Cleveland, where I sat behind a scrim and did a mixture of improvisation, Irish tunes, and pre-selected classical music that went with the script of this play. It was a fascinating experience, and ultimately just felt like there had to be more. Like I had to experience those things that I was starting to miss by being in this kind of confined environment. So at the same time, I still wanted to be a cello soloist. I had not yet changed my idea of what that meant. I'd gotten scared off of using that word, but that was still my dream. I just wanted to play concertos with orchestras and do everything else that I could musically. And I noticed that while I was having some success with competitions, my friends who would win the big international competitions were starting to see that after 2 years, that effect would wear off. They'd have concerts for 1, 2, or 3 years, essentially however long the concerts had been pre-programmed by presenters who would hire the winner of the Tchaikovsky competition. And then once those concerts dropped off, that was it. There was no follow-up. And the presenters were interested in the next Tchaikovsky competition winner. I couldn't really articulate it at the time, but what I was sensing and what I was seeing was not just the lack of preparation and teamwork that it takes to build a career and an artistic voice, but also that you have to be committed to your artistic voice, even when you're presenting it in places that are going to judge you differently, like a competition. And that if people were selected not because of their voice, but just because they were better than everyone else at doing the same thing, someone's going to come along and be better at that anyway. So I started to think a lot about voice, about what that meant without really being able to articulate it. And I also decided that competitions weren't going to work. So I auditioned to become the principal cellist of the Seattle Symphony. I won, which was kind of crazy. I was 22 and I took the job. I had 3 other auditions scheduled, but I canceled them because that was the best for me in terms of position and pay. And position was very important because I wanted to be able to have a platform from which to explore other opportunities. And I did. Seattle was in kind of a crazy time. There was a lot of politicking going on. And it was kind of nasty at the time. And I think a lot of people looked to me as a distraction or maybe even a way out of that. This 22-year-old kid was a great thing to put on the cover of a magazine instead of the New York Times headline of orchestral terrorism in Seattle. So that really amplified, that's a story for another time, but that really amplified my presence. And I was able to, again, begin collaborating with people outside of classical music. The second I got to Seattle, I started showing up in the sort of round robin performances off kind of hidden theater district things, playing in bars, collaborating with everyone from jazz musicians to rock and roll bands. And I even got asked to curate a series after I had a recital that did really well at a local venue called Town Hall Seattle. So this was one of the biggest things. I did not see it at the time, but this was one of the biggest things that happened to me in terms of broadening my view of myself as a performer and as an artist beyond the impact I'd always hoped to make. I think when I was a kid, I had this idea that music helps change people. Like music just has that power. And I read a quote about Mendelssohn. I think, Mendelssohn. Menuhin. He played the Mendelssohn very well, which is why I was thinking of it. Yehudi Menuhin, thinking that if he played, I think it was the Bach Chaconne perfectly, that something would change inside of whoever heard it. I'm butchering the quote because I had a very similar feeling that if I could just somehow disappear into music and music would come out of me so purely that it was untainted by imperfection, whatever that means. Let's not even dive into that. But that whoever heard it couldn't help but spontaneously erupt into this enlightened manifestation, and world peace would spread. And so it felt like a calling for me, which was very powerful. But that's a very different ideal than what it takes to actually have music be more impactful than just a feeling. And so this opportunity to be a curator was something that kind of changed my view of that over time once I gave into it, that I could actually give other people opportunities, that I could think about who I was giving the opportunities, what voice I was showing through being a curator, and what platform I was allowing other people to share their voice on, paying attention to the way a community reacted to that over time, the way that they would grow, pushing them, but finding a way not to let go of their hand in the process. And even reflecting back for myself on how I put programs together that I would give to presenters. That was very powerful for me to start suddenly being able to see myself a little bit through other people's shoes. What it would take to convince a presenter that I had something unique, different to offer. So that was a very impactful moment in my career. I ended up leaving the Seattle Symphony after 2 years. I very committed to this idea of being a cello soloist. And so I just said, look, I've paid off my student loans. I'm out. I'm moving to New York. Thank you. It was amazing, but I've got to move on. And I very luckily managed to sign right after that with Opus 3 Management and start getting concerts and building that. I got a publicist not long after that, had some really great opportunities at the beginning and started making that happen. I kept the curation aspect in town hall, which has been very important for me. It was interesting signing with management at 24. People thought it was a big deal that I had won this principal job at 22, and maybe so, but signing with management to be a soloist at 24 felt very late. So I struggled with that. I felt like I had a lot of street cred that helped me. I had a lot of self-confidence that may not have helped me at times. But it was very different than being sort of a young prodigy that was guided by other people. I was making all of these decisions myself, sort of just shooting from the hip, trying to follow my dream and figure out what my voice was. And I know that a big part of what attracted Opus 3 to me was the fact that I was getting known as this person who did all these different things. The question and the conflict kind of immediately arose, though. It's like, how do you sell yourself as someone who does everything or someone who's on an exploration? That's a very specific kind of journey. And you see a lot of bands struggling. I'll relate it to bands with the sophomore album. They'll release an album, their freshman album, their first album gets a lot of fans. And then, of course, you're a band, you're exploring, you're musicians, you get tired of touring all of that, so you start doing new things. And then the second album, the sophomore album, sounds totally different. And you'll lose a lot of fans because they don't recognize the band that they thought you were. So in something that's so gig-based versus tour-based, like classical music, how do you set yourself up so that the image that you project and what you're selling is true to the artistic exploration? And that's a question that I'm still trying to answer, but that was when I began to see the roots of that. And that's one of the things, going back to not only how do I find my voice in music, but how do I make a career out of that journey? Something that I want to talk about later. So that was the beginning of sort of understanding that. And at the same time, my reconnection with that, what I grew up with, was growing by leaps and bounds, helped immensely by things like the TED conference. I became a TED fellow in 2011 and immediately felt very at home being with scientists, journalists, human rights advocates, like just people that didn't know anything necessarily about music, loved music, but I felt more at home in some ways there than I did hanging out with my cellists that I could geek out with, because it was more true to my experience growing up. And that in turn led me to really think about, again, the voice. What does it mean to move forward? Well, for me, a lot of times I start by looking back. What is in the past that has, where do I come from, and how does that help me relate to not only who I am now, but have a perspective from which to relate to other people? Because when I've felt like I'm just floating around doing everything, there's not enough solid ground to stand on to look from another perspective. It's one of those weird sort of two-sided coins that if you really want to have empathy, you also have to understand who you are and the limits of who you are. Artistically as well, that plays into it. One of the other things that happened around that time was that I met Anna Devere Smith. Anna Devere Smith is an actor who has been a very, very good friend of mine now for almost 10 years, and a mentor and a colleague, and someone who really challenged me. And she's definitely a role model for me at this point. She is an activist, an artist, a teacher. If you recognize her from television, it would be from The West Wing or Blackish or Nurse Jackie. But she is most known for her stage works, where she does this amazing thing of becoming other people. She will interview people on a subject. I think her breakout one was about the LA riots in '92. And she interviewed all kinds of different people, a Korean grocer, a gangbanger, a police officer, all these different, many, many, many people, and then studied their interviews and learned parts of them verbatim and pieced them together to create this narrative. When you see her changing from person to person and giving their stories and their words, you really get a sense of the breadth of experience through essentially the voice of Anna. It's very powerful. So we worked together on something like that. And through that process and watching her process of taking life and sort of viewing it through an artistic lens was very impactful for me. So at this point, I have another question prompt. Anna is one of the first people that I would say that I knew that was not a musician that I consider a huge influence on me. So I'm curious, and you can take a minute to think about this as we keep going, but can you think about and type into the chat somebody or a couple of people, and this is where this is important, they don't have to be musicians, someone who has influenced your artistic process, your music. For me, Anna is a person who's done that. Yo-Yo Ma is a huge person who's done that. Someone that I never met would be Jimi Hendrix. I mean, there's a huge span. But think about that and type something into the chat. Somebody or a couple of people who have influenced your process, your art, your music, and they don't have to be musicians. Just anyone that you knew. So we're almost caught up to now, and then I want to actually start having a conversation rather than just talking at you. So one of the things that happened through Anna is that I accidentally became a composer. I had experience, as I said, with improv in various settings, sort of just because I had to, and because jazz but that I hadn't really done much on the cello. I had mostly done on the bass and had not really touched it for years. So with Anna, there was a misunderstanding when we were working on the project that we did together. We were looking for very specific music, very specific moods to work as the character of the cello. And I'd been trying to use Bach, and Bach wasn't really working for this spot, and we didn't want to chop it up or extend it. We didn't want to mess with Bach. So instead, we thought, okay, what about Ligeti? What about George Crumb? All the other solo cello music, and that wasn't working either. So we finally, frustrated, I think it was about a month into the process, I just sort of played something on the cello, and I was like, well, I think the sound we're going for is this, so I'm going to look for this. And she said, yes, that's it. Just play that one. And I said, oh, that's not a piece though. I'm sorry. And I'll look for something that sounds like that. But I was just making something up. She said, oh, well, why can't you do that again? And there was the misunderstanding, was that I realized it was my misunderstanding. I was actually composing. I was improvising. And if I played it again and wrote it down, that would be the music. And was there any reason not to do that? I mean, that's how it started. That's how composing started. I just had never thought of myself in that way. And so I ended up kind of half composing. I wrote down the themes over the process, several months of developing this, and ended up accidentally kind of half composing, half improvising all of the music for this show, which ended up being about, I don't know, 40 minutes of music. It was quite a lot. And this all went a step further. By the way, thank you. I see the chats coming in. I'm going to read them in a moment more carefully. The next year, that same organization reached out to me, and after being unable to find composers to write a solo cello piece to open another art project, this is Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, which they wanted me to do this concert for. They said, well, why don't you write a piece? And I said, I'm not a composer. They're like, come on, you wrote the music for Anna's thing last year. And I said, well, I didn't really write it. I kind of like half wrote it and improvised it each time. And I just couldn't convince them that that wasn't composing. So I ended up taking my first official commission, again, kind of based on a misunderstanding. And that really affected me a lot in how I viewed and how I continue to view the trajectory of classical music and the tradition that we're in. I feel like my experience has been one of those accidental discovery things where at each step, I've kind of replicated what happened historically without meaning to. That I was making sound, enjoying it, and someone asked me to do it again. I was like, well, I guess I can do it again. And accidentally started repeating things, and then was asked to do it more explicitly and became, I guess, a composer. And then for various reasons grew into that. And that has taught me a lot about being open and about, again, looking backwards for inspiration in how to move forward. And it's reframed my whole view of classical music. As a side note, I've decided that to think of classical music as a canon is a fallacy, that it really, if we want to continue, then it should be that we look back at the tradition, which is a tradition of creativity and innovation based on studying what came before and then moving past it and moving forward. So I know there are a lot of different ways to look at that, but that has changed. That has changed a lot. Now, it's not easy to do all of that. The word entrepreneur certainly starts to come in when you start doing various projects. And it's something that I do not like that word. I do not feel comfortable with the idea of doing that. I still am struggling to embrace that. I suppose that I am. And yet organization has kind of been antithetical to progress for me in moments where I've needed to toss everything to the side and find a new way of doing things. So one of the things that I think about a lot, again, relating back to this journey, to this voice, to this career, and how they all tie together, is finding structures that allow for the most creativity and the evolution, again, not just of what I'm doing, but of the process that I use to find it. And recently that has taken a huge turn with the pandemic and then the social justice movements that have begun to raise their voices louder than they have in previous years in incredibly inspirational and motivational ways, as obviously as a reaction to very terrible things. So in my own struggle to tie all of these different elements together, it's a constant thought of mine about these dichotomies. How do you have freedom and organization at the same time? How do you do something that feels solid and yet at the same time continue to explore? How do you perform and execute something at a high level while leaving room for things to be new each time, as if you're just discovering them? And I think that thread runs through everything from how we practice to how we think about preparing, to how we write music, how we choose who we interact with, the business models that we have, and ultimately life and society itself. Those two things are really, that's the crux of a lot. So before I open it up, I just want to, again, go over these questions that I asked at the beginning. And then I want to ask you to share your thoughts in response to those, or maybe your questions of me about, challenge me. How am I making good on that? What can I share that helps you? What questions about your voice and your career relate or don't relate to that? So again, these questions that we started with: how do I find my voice in music? How can I get comfortable with the constant artistic evolution of process? How do I make a career out of this journey? How do I choose what to put my energy into when there are so many options? And how do I serve others through all of this? So if you want to go ahead and type your questions or your comments, and then we can maybe choose, and you can pop on the screen and out. I would love to interact. In the meantime, I'm going to read the comments. I'm seeing we have lots of composers, violinist and improviser, cellist and improviser, sometimes improviser. Love it. San Diego, Seattle, Boulder, New York, all across the country. Boston, Michigan, Honolulu. I was just in Honolulu last summer. And influences. Love these influences. Yes. First organ, Bjork, fun. Gabriel Rifrido Terrazas, I didn't say that right. Simone de Beauvoir, wonderful. All right, so thank you for sharing those. And yes, I am now going to see any questions, concerns.
So Joshua, maybe while we're waiting for people to write in questions and think about questions that they might want to talk about, I just think it's so easy, it's so interesting. Your career it's not a bug that you like to do lots of different things. It's a feature that you like to do lots of different things. And one of the things that everybody always says is you should be the person who does that. Right? Or if you want to be a cellist, you should be a great cellist. But like the other stuff, don't confuse people, right? What's your principal value? Like, what are people going to call you for? So how do you negotiate that? I mean, how have you made yourself into the person that people want to call because you're the person who does lots of things?
I mean, I think that's a great question. And there are so many levels on which you can answer that question. I would say on the most microscopic level, I very firmly believe that every time I have been able to absorb a new element or a new technique or a new way of learning, it has affected in a positive way, if I do it right, in a positive way, everything else that I do. And the very most specific example that I will give is first improvising and then composing and then affecting my interpretation. When I learned really that improvisation gave me this freedom in performing because I wasn't afraid of things going wrong, because I knew how to get back, even in terms of memory slips. I've never really been afraid of memory, except I was taught to memorize things at a very young age, very differently. But I also really think that improvisation helped because knowing how to get around and how to see what's coming and work my way back. If anything ever happened, I just made my way. It was fine. Composing actually put me in the composer's shoes and made me ask questions about interpretation very differently than I had as a performer who didn't have that experience, where I would look at the Dvorak concerto and see the word of God. I began to see the decisions that Dvorak had made. And when I really started to apply that to the interpretive process, things opened up, and the way that I would play things. Hi, Ruby, how you doing? Ruby's coming and say hi. Things opened up in a very different way, and I was able to feel much more comfortable with the living evolution of an interpretation, as well as the things that I was convicted about being a certain way in terms of style, etc. So that was very impactful, and that is the microscopic level, right? That's how I use that to make myself a better performer. Then building out from there, sharing that process, talking about that process, getting to know people who appreciate that process. And the more I'm able to do that, the more connections as a performer come along as well that are real solid connections that go beyond, I like how you played that, and go to a real sort of approach connection. And that's for a good career, I think that's very important, to have people you align with in values, not just like how you played something.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer on both levels, you know, and I think you've been able to make that, like I said, something that you're known for, rather than trying to kind of sneak around and you know, feel badly about having a good sense of curiosity and not wanting to do all these things, you know. Um, so then everybody else has to figure it out how to market you.
It's not, well, and also I will say it's a lot of work. I mean, it's you add hours to everything that you do when you expand it. And I don't want to minimize that. I throw so much into what I do, and I've sacrificed a lot of other things in order to make it happen. And that's because not only do I love doing that, but I feel compelled in some ways to prove that it can be done at a very high level. And that's not necessarily wise or advisable for everybody. I mean, it's kind of crazy, but for me, to go out there and set out to prove that you shouldn't make a choice, that you should do it all, and that can make you better, that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, and how do you, you know, we'll wait for other questions, but I'm happy to dive in and have this conversation with you because I'm really interested. Um, how do you then negotiate that? I mean, how do you are you a composer when you're a composer, and or are you a composer and a cellist in the same day? You know, how everybody approaches that differently. I mean, some people say you have to sit down and write every day, and other people say that, you know, you're going to be a cellist for the week that you're playing a concerto with the orchestra, and then you're going to take a month off and write music. And how do you segment your brain and your day?
I've been learning about that. It's interesting. I think, again, because of how I started with composing, I started doing it in a room with other people who just wanted to hear what they were going to hear. So I didn't even get to prepare. I was just literally doing it on the spot. And when I started getting commissions to write bigger pieces, I started realizing that I needed to have quiet time for certain parts of the process, especially the beginning of the process, to get ideas that went beyond being a good idea and started to turn into music that could be developed. Really takes time. I love John Cleese. I don't know if any of you have ever seen his lecture on creativity, but he talks about, I think he uses it's either 90 minutes or 3 hours, but he talks about having to sit there with an okay idea in order to make it great. And he said that when he was in Monty Python, is Ruby okay? Yeah, Ruby's Ruby's very excited in the other room. She got a cello introduction earlier today. We've been holding off on that, but she'll get more later. Yeah, so John Cleese talking about that said that when he was in Monty Python, often he would get an idea that wasn't as good as other people's idea, but he would spend more time with it. And so his sketches would be more consistently on screen, not because he was better at ideas, but because he was more patient with working them out, seeing what was there and turning them into something feasible. And so that takes time. After that, once things are worked out, orchestration for me, or just like finishing things, that's much easier in terms of being able to just jump into it without having to have 3 hours of quiet first. And so I can do that on the road. I can do that in hotel rooms, and even if I really have to, on airplanes. I hate doing that on airplanes, but when you travel 80% of the time as a classical cello soloist, it happens. So all of the above, I'm still learning. I'm in Santa Barbara because of my very first residency just to write a piece, and having 2 months back in December and January before all of the pandemic happened to just compose was very frightening and powerful for me, and I think very productive.
That's great. We do now have a couple questions if you want to tackle those.
Sure. Do we want to, Jerry, do you want to go ahead and ask your question in person?
Sure. Hi.
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, I was wondering, whenever one tackles, especially in classical music industry, the performance level is so high to really excel and be excellent in each of these things. When we see, I'm a conductor and I love working in different kinds of genres, but it's hard. You don't have many that are really great composers and conductors, or performers and conductors and such. And I was wondering, because it takes so much time to do all of these things really well, and how do you negotiate performing at a high level for all the multiple things that you do?
So I think that thank you, first of all, for the question and for asking and being here. But I think my answer is a little dissatisfying to me, because I'm going to tell you the straight up truth, which is that I think that I let my composing suffer if it's going to start affecting my performing. I don't like to say that. I don't like to admit that. But the deadline of being on stage always has felt more pressing to me than turning in a piece. And that's definitely my history of coming from performance to composition, and of also being a pretty quick study. So if someone gives me a piece late, as has happened almost every time I've commissioned any of the, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of pieces. I was trying to make a list. I think it's over 100 pieces I've premiered, maybe 200 or 300, lots. And almost all of them have been late. So I kind of let that get a little behind. I'm trying to work on that. But I think ultimately it might be impossible to not just have to accept that some things are going to get less time than you want, and to just prioritize for what are your strongest values. And for me, it's not that composing is less valued so much as that I don't have the reputation that I do with performing as a composer at this point. And so as I'm building that, I've been able, for better or worse, to get away with things because I'm riding on my performer reputation. And I can also change things. I can continue to change things. I didn't study composition. I had like 2 lessons. So I don't have very much ego about it in that way. And that's allowed me the freedom. I think that even if I had, though, there's always going to be that choice of either you say no to things so that you get the time that you need. And that's very difficult, I think, for any of us to do. I think that would be the ideal for me, is if I could just say no to enough things that I could really focus on every performance and every commission. Or you decide what is most important to you in terms of your output, and you make sure that even if the other things suffer, that never does. And that's a very hard thing to decide because we all want to be good at everything that we do. But I think that that is the only practical way to do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then was it Rocio?
Hi. Sorry, my webcam stopped working this
That's
afternoon.
okay.
But you mentioned that after being working in Seattle, you moved to New York, and I was wondering, how did you begin to build your career and network once you moved to New York? Right now, I just finished my master's, and I'm living I'm moving to New York City too, and I think it's a little bit challenging now or in this time, but I was wondering if you have any advices about that.
Thank you. That is such a good question that I actually talk with a lot of colleagues and friends about, because there's this idea, and I think it's only true to a certain extent. There's this idea that you have to make it in New York to make it as a classical musician in America, unless you just get an orchestra job or a teaching job. And that's something that, I basically just moved to New York because when I was about to leave Seattle, I had not yet left when I signed with management. And my new manager, this amazing manager who had Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble, Gil Shaham, and Christian Zimmerman, she's like top of the top. And she was like, you've got to move to New York. So I moved to New York. I didn't want to move I wanted to move to Berlin. But she said, as an American cellist, you have to build your career in America, and New York is where you do that. And the advice that she gave me and what she really wanted me to do was, and I think that on some level, this is what you kind of have to do. You find the people that you click with. You find, it takes a little while if you don't already know. When you get there, you take whatever gigs you can, and the people that are doing the things that are most inspiring and interesting to you, you really like build those relationships and you grow out from there. The bigger question, I think, is, do you have to do that in New York? And I know people who have managed to build careers that are very, very fulfilling, not always as big, but for some of them, like James Innes doesn't live in New York, he lives in Florida. And he's one of the most in-demand violin soloists outside of Joshua Bell today. It's tough. I think if you're going to move to New York, you have to put the time in to find the community or communities that you feel most inspired by and that you also have something to contribute to, and it'll start to reveal yourself. Everything is there. It's a challenging place to live. I was gone so much that I never really felt like I lived there. So I never fully connected with any community because I was just showing up for 3 days, 5 days, a week at a time. That's it. That's all I would have throughout the year. So
yeah,
I'm not sure if that really answers that. I mean, are there any questions that come from that?
Well, I already live in New York. I just live a little bit in the north.
Which part?
I live in Westchester.
Oh, yeah. Nice.
Yeah, it was helpful. Yeah, I think I'll try to move around with people that I already know and to get to build stronger connections with them.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm going to back up just for a second because this is something that I alluded to when I was speaking earlier. How do you choose where to put your energy when there are so many options? And I think this is a great case study for that. When you're in New York, there are so many different scenes, even in classical music, even as a cellist. I think I see your profile photo with a cello. So, yeah. So as a cellist in New York, there's too much for one person to even understand, let alone do. There's so much going on. So how do you decide where to put your energy? And I think that it should be this question that starts with why are you in music? What is it that you care most about? How can you help other people through your music? Who is doing those things? How can you meet them? Can you help them do those things better? And does it continually help you explore possibilities of what you can do? Or is it just checking off boxes because people are at a certain place? Like there are the career moves that you can make. Like if you get this gig or you get in with that contractor or this or that, that's fine. But is that fulfilling ultimately? 10 years down the road, what will you have built? So even though it's a little slower and it's hard to ask those questions sometimes or to know the answers, I would be asking those questions. And, Mr. Rogers always said, look for the helpers. I would look for the people that are doing the great things that you want to be a part of and go see if you can help them.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Of course. Thank you. Ah, Jerry, that's very sweet. I hope so, because I'm going to try to stay here in Santa Barbara. It's nice here. Surfing.
It's a great place to be.
Yeah.
If we're waiting for more questions, what were you working on? What was your residency? What were you writing?
So I was writing a double concerto for Vadim Glucksmann, the violinist, and myself and the Pro Music Chamber Orchestra. And it's called Confluence. It will get premiered in May of 2021 now, hopefully, fingers crossed. It was going to be April of this year. But there are so many interesting things coming out of this. I mean, we haven't even touched on reorganizing things for social justice, which I think is such a big part of what so many people rightly are looking at doing, and the power of art over the centuries and that part of the tradition, which we really should take a look at. There are a lot of questions we have to ask ourselves about what our industry does and what it views as acceptable and who it lets in. Those are very important, difficult questions, especially for a white male like myself. Got to really think about that. But there are also lots of opportunities in this particular moment because of the technology that everyone is having to engage with. And very specifically as a composer, one thing that I'm looking at doing is putting together, I will not do this to put it out. I refuse to do that, but a click track so that I can hear my piece almost 10 months, 8 months before the premiere and make any revisions that I would have made after the premiere beforehand. So that's something that I hope to be able to organize. And there are many other things I hear people doing like that. What can we use about this moment to address things that take time and take patience in a world where usually we're moving like what's happening right now? How do I get ready for tomorrow? I'm behind on this and that. So as much as I want to be super productive, I think slowing down and letting those things happen is also very important.
What was it like to have the time, those couple months that actually now are turned into 3 or 4 months, being 6 or whatever it is, being on the treadmill, right? And having to try and find that time to write in between everything else, and then all of a sudden having nothing but time.
Well, I'm kind of, it's been a very personal struggle during this time. I'm prone to depression, and I'm an introvert, but I've really realized the nuance of my introversion, which is that I need to be around people, but able to have my own space. And I don't know how much of that comes from how I was raised in a big family where, private space to actually work on things was important, but you came together throughout the day to check in. How much of that is about being a musician, where again, you go off into your practice room to get better, and then you show up at rehearsal prepared to get even better, or vice versa, whichever it is. But it's that mix of alone time and being with other people. It's been very hard for me. And I sort of oscillate between overly ambitious projects that are going to take 24/7 and change the world, and then just like binging on Netflix. So my current situation, I think, is better because I'm now living in the house with my friend Scott and his 3-year-old daughter Ruby, and it's just such a better energy than where I was before, and I'm finding a lot more motivation just being able to check in with somebody not on a screen throughout the day.
Yeah. Well, thanks for being honest about all those issues.
It's tough
because they're real. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah. Sometimes I would just like let the cello sit over in the corner, hoping osmosis would help. It doesn't really work. But you have to take care of yourself. I mean, when I started out, cellist, composer, curator, musician, artist, entrepreneur, activist, human. Part of being human is that you can't do everything. And again, back to I think it was Jerry's question. You can't do everything. There's no such thing as perfection. And getting A+ in everything means that you're leaving some things out. So anytime we're asking about excellence, I think we have to consider our whole lives and be realistic about the sacrifices that it takes and why we're doing it. Why are you doing this? Who are you serving? And if you can't look around, this is something I've started to realize, and it's been tough for me. If I'm only trying to change the life of this imaginary person that I created when I was a kid that I had never met, that's in an audience somewhere, but I'm not actually using the work that I do to make the people who are closest to me, to make their lives better, then it's never going to happen. It's just a fantasy. I've created this world that doesn't really touch people. You start with the people you know. You think about your work, how it affects them, what it can do for them, and you move out from there. Don't have your entire career and artistic life based on an imaginary person that you're never going to meet. Make a difference in the lives of the people that you know and build out from there.
That's great. That's really inspirational, especially now that our communities are strange in this way. The people who are closest to you actually might not be closest to you, but you can still have a profound effect on people. Yeah. Jerry just had one other question too.
Great. Jerry, you want to pop on and ask this one? I think this is perfect. Sure. Sort of last question too.
I mean, in working, I do a lot of work with orchestras as well as new music ensembles, and I teach in Houston, and so I enjoy the variety. But when I'm working with some orchestras, right now there's a fight for survival to get on, especially as we see what is happening in with like New York Philharmonic or the Met as they're going dark, or Nashville Symphony now is going dark for the whole season. It just seems like it's impossible to go back to the way the things were. I mean, certain things were broken about the system, but there's some institutions more than others are still trying to go back to the way things were because I guess it was comfortable. But how can we encourage them to try new models, to try new formats? I mean, sometimes we have no choice. I mean, right now we sort of have no choice, but to get because within an institution, there's so many people you have to bring on board to do that. And I'm just going to start work with a large institution starting in the fall and trying to and I'm in a very more minor role, but just how to, I guess, help spur a very more adventurous mindset for people to, I mean, maybe it's just sort of setting it up myself first and then being something, but I didn't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Thank you for the question, Jerry. And before I answer, I just want to, Peter, if we go over a little bit, is that okay?
No, it's fine.
Yeah,
it's
people
fine.
need to leave, just go ahead and leave. Thank you for everyone. In case you do have to leave, thank you for being here. Really, it's good to have this connection.
It's all Zoom time these days.
Okay, so. Yeah, right? So Yeah, Jerry, to answer your question, I think there are a lot of ways. I have typically thought of myself as someone who's kind of in a consultant role because I do travel around. Well, not now, because before 2020, literally 80% of my time was hopping on airplanes to go to different places, like 140, 150,000 miles a year. And I felt like I had the opportunity to share this perspective that comes from seeing different places, how they work, how they don't work, and then at the same time getting to know certain locations and certain people and certain organizations over the course of a year, 5 years, 10 years, even longer. Great example is the Music Academy of the West. I was here in 2002 as a fellow, and Scott Reed and I connected in 2010, I think. A little over 10 years ago in the spring when I came to play with the Santa Barbara Symphony. And since that time, I've been doing things in Santa Barbara and at the Music Academy of the West at least once a year, usually somewhere between 3 to 5 times a year. So that's been an ongoing relationship. And I don't know what influence I can say that I've had on Scott, like by myself. But I do know that I see him doing with the Music Academy, especially this summer, and the way that they've moved online and the way that they're bringing in voices, even dealing with the reconciliation of classical music's issues with race. That's a conversation topic that I don't think the Music Academy would have put in 3 years ago. And again, I'm not going to take any credit for that, but these are things that we've talked about, and I know other people must have been talking about, and he thinks about. But that encouragement, that constant just talking about it, first of all, I think is important. If it's something that you really care about, don't let a conversation just be about how beautiful the ocean is. I'm pointing at the ocean over here because I would talk about that all day. Like talk about that other stuff too. Talk about the places that you've seen that do it really well as models. You know, I'm learning now that it really helps, and this is not natural for me, it really helps to have resources to point to over and over again. That if I'm going to talk about something that I care about, I shouldn't improvise every time. That every conversation can be its own thing, but if there's a resource, if there's a book that just says it super well, I can bring that book into every conversation about that topic. I shouldn't feel weird about that. That it's actually very helpful for me to understand that that is part of my perspective, and that helps. Institutions are slow. We all know this. They're slow. I personally believe that we need to encourage a full court press on issues, especially during this time where we can't be in our normal mode, that it's a full court press of really overt, strongly worded activism. I'm not going to get super political, but I'm like, in a moment like this, I'm not going to say anything against the Black people who are frustrated and looting. Like, it's not my place. I do not have that frustration because I've not lived that life. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, I also know white people with which I need to have conversations that there's a chance that that conversation could help change their mind if I do it the right way. That if I'm able to say, look, I know this is hard, but I'm going to try to help walk you through it gently because it's important. That it takes everything in between those as well. There's a huge spectrum, and that we need all of that. That we need all of those. No one person can, I don't think, change an entire institution, and no one perspective can change society. It takes all of it. And when the weight starts to shift, there's a moment, there's an opportunity that I think we all can be a part of in various ways. So identifying helpers and encouraging them, even if it's not the same way that you would do it, I think is very important. And that doesn't mean that you have to do every way, you know, but if you know that there are shared values and there are people working on promoting those values with a different method, just saying, hey, I know we want to see the same thing. I appreciate you're doing it a different way, and I just want to support you. I'm going to keep pushing in the way that I'm pushing, and maybe we check in and team up. I think that teamwork and identifying shared values are the most powerful assets in a movement and creating change, even within an institution. That's not super specific, I know. But I think putting all of that together, resources, good models, and finding teams and finding helpers and creating that shared sense of momentum is powerful.
Great,
And
thank you so much.
yeah, and for better or worse, it seems like the times require it now. I think it's really harder. It's harder for people to be in denial, across the whole spectrum.
The cracks in the system are obvious to more people than ever before. They're always there. Now they're just really obvious.
Yeah. So maybe we can harness that, to make some real change, because there is no going back to the way things were, literally, if we're talking about concerts for the next 6 months. So we have to find other solutions. So
yeah, I might, if it's okay, the last thing I'll say is kind of just, again, tying everything together. When the pandemic first hit, I lost $60,000 worth of work in a day. It was a hard phone call, and it immediately saw all of my plans disintegrate. And so I shut down. I also wasn't feeling well. I thought I might have coronavirus. I still need to get the antibody test and see if that was the case. We'll see. And so I immediately started thinking about what this was going to be and how this time would work. I have access through TED and through other relationships that I've developed with amazing scientists and epidemiologists. And so much quicker than the media was putting out there and that anyone else in my family, I got a real picture of how long this is going to take that felt pretty solid and has borne out to be true. And I immediately prepared myself for 18 months before playing a real concert again in person. That was like day one. And that was hard, but so I immediately started asking, okay, well then what's this going to be? What am I going to make of this? And what I landed on, I hope, is a note of optimism, which again ties all of this together. And I've tried to use as my guiding light when I've been able to get off of Netflix and work, which is that nothing that we're dealing with right now is anything new. The same things that we want human connection, we want opportunity to be alive, to experience love, to share, to grow, to have joy. We want those same things. The inequalities and the challenges that we face individually, as groups, as society, those are also the same. There's just, all of a sudden, there's this catalyst. This catalyst of the pandemic has made it more obvious, and it's made it that we can't turn away from it. We all have to look at the problems that have been there all along, and we all have to consider the values that have been there all along. And I think we should ask ourselves, if my values and the things that I use to guide what I do, be it my relationships, my music, my art, my job, if those values aren't working for me now, were they the values I should have had to begin with? I think that's a very important question. And the sooner that we recognize what's at the very core of what we feel and what we use to connect with other people and what's important to us, the better our decisions are, and the more hope there is for us to really build things during this time that, even if it's small, are powerful changes for how we live with each other on this small, increasingly chaotic feeling earth. So that's, I think, hopefully a sort of realistic message of hope during this time. If we take the time, really, really think, why? we'll get to things that we can do that should carry us through whatever comes, even if how we do them changes.
That's really beautiful. Thanks, Joshua, and thanks for the inspiration and for being really honest, and bringing everything to us and sharing so totally. I think that's a gift in itself, and I really appreciate that, and I know that everybody who's been listening really appreciates that. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I look forward to hearing things and seeing you in person when that's possible. And in the meantime, stay strong and be creative and share with each other. Be open and vulnerable. That's the best thing we have going for us. Our vulnerabilities are the most powerful connection. So thank you.
Thanks for demonstrating that to us in real time. So thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. See you soon.